traditional lands those of us who are in Canberra live and are meeting today, and pay our respect to the community's elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging. So the Acknowledgement of Country is particularly important for the Synapse seminars because they're organised around the idea that real collaboration with Indigenous communities in Australia and the surrounding region requires us to step out of our disciplinary silos and to engage Indigenous history in a profoundly transdisciplinary way. Synapse is a monthly seminar. It's usually the last Monday of each month, and it's hosted by the ANU School of Culture, History and Language. It started running in February last year and is convened this year by Dr. Beth Evans, who's put together a fantastic program of speakers and topics that runs through until the end of the year. Synapse has featured or will feature speakers who come from backgrounds in archaeology, anthropology, ecology and evolution, genetics, history, linguistics, and philosophy. But all of them share the idea that real insights into the processes of cultural history can flow only from this resynthesis of findings from this wide range of disciplines, working in close partnership with Indigenous communities. And a synapse is, of course, the gap or the portal between neurons that provides the wiring for the nervous system. While synapses connect neurons to each other, they also link neurons and muscle, or the brain and the body, allowing us to move from thought to action, or perhaps from theory to practice. And so, as a series, Synapse is particularly interested in the theoretical development of ideas about deep history, along with the initiation of concrete field and lab research that's designed to explore those ideas and put them into practice. Our speaker today is Dr. Shimona Kealy, who's something of a rising and very well-published star in the field of early colonization of the paleocontinent of Sahul. From a background in marsupial phylogeny, she gained her PhD in archaeology from the ANU in 2019, working with Professor Sue O'Connor's ARC Laureate project on understanding modern human dispersal, adaptation, and behaviour en route to Australia. Her work explores not just the movement of early humans between Sunda and Sahul, but also their ecological impact on the intervening islands. And I gather she's now planning some really fascinating work tracking the human transfer across this region of particular animals, such as the various phalangerid cuscus species. But that's for another seminar. Today, Shimona will be reviewing some of the findings and the implications of her work on the earliest sea voyages to Australia, maps, models, and anecdotes from the field. Shimona, it's all yours.
Wow, got to live up to that. Thank you, Chris. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen with everyone, which will hopefully go smoothly. So we can have a look at the PowerPoint slides. All right, so I'll just say thanks again, everyone, for zooming in for this. I think last I checked, there was over 40 people. So thanks for taking time out of your day to join the Synapse seminar. And yeah, so today I'll be looking at the earliest sea voyages that people took to reach Australia. And most of it's work from my PhD, but then a smattering of work that's occurred since. And part of that was, most of the PhD, as Chris said, was done under Professor Sue O'Connor's Laureate project. But then the research has continued in what we call CARBA, or the ARC Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. And this is a really big centre of excellence that combines researchers from a wide number of universities in Australia and overseas. So I'll get on with this. The first thing to look at, and one of the first questions we ask ourselves when we want to look at people moving through this region, is obviously, when did people first arrive in Australia? And this is still up for debate. The oldest archaeological site here is in Northern Australia, the site of Majabibi, and it's dated to somewhere between 53 and 65,000 years ago. There is, however, a little bit of controversy about this site. Various different dating techniques were used, and it's quite a bit older than the other sites that are known so far from Australia, which all date around 50,000. However, based on both our archaeological and genetic records, we can be confident that people arrived at least some time before 50,000 years ago in Australia. And at this time, we need to remember that Australia was connected to New Guinea in the continental landmass known as Sahul. And over to the west, we had the modern islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java all joined to mainland Southeast Asia. And this was known as Sunda. So if you're not familiar with the terminology, I'll probably be using these words quite frequently. So Sahul is Australia and New Guinea, and Sunda is our sort of the furthest extent of mainland Southeast Asia when sea levels were lowered. So why is this area interesting? The biggest thing to understand about this region is that the islands that lie between these two continental landmasses of Sunda and Sahul have always been islands. They were never connected to the mainlands of either of the continents. So there was never any type of land bridge between Australia and Southeast Asia. So you always have these islands, and you always have some degree of sea crossings required to cross between the two continents and sort of island hop across. And this area was identified by the famous Alfred Russel Wallace, who along with Darwin discovered the theory of natural selection. But he's also famous for drawing this line known as Wallace's line that comes down between Sulawesi and Borneo and then down between Bali and Lombok. And this is known as Wallace's line, and he identified it as a significant barrier to east-west dispersal of both plants and animals. And since then, this whole region of this island region has been identified as a biogeographic transitionary zone between our two continental landmasses and has been named after him as the area of Wallacea. Now, not just plants and animals are affected by this. The presence of permanent sea channels between these islands means that people had to make multiple sea crossings to reach Australia or Australia and New Guinea, the area of Sahul, from the mainland. Now, there are unfortunately very few Wallacean, our island sites, that preserve Homo sapiens occupation prior to about 30,000 years ago. So if you remember, the Majabibi site in Northern Australia is dating to somewhere between 53 and 65,000 years ago. Even if we take the youngest date of 53, most of the sites in this island area are significantly younger. There's a couple of exceptions that are coming closer, so I thought we'd have a quick look at them before we go on. So one of the most famous sites in Flores Island is the site of Liang Bua. And while it's very famous for the Hobbit, the Homo floresiensis, that are dated somewhere around 190,000 years ago, it does have a modern Homo sapiens record that begins somewhere around the sort of 48,000 years ago. In addition to Flores, on the island of Timor and in the independent nation of Timor-Leste in the north, in the east, sorry, is the site of Asida Kuru, which is previously known as Jeri Malai. And this site is famous for having some of the oldest fish hooks and evidence for pelagic or deep sea fishing by our species. And the dates here for occupation go back around the 46,000 year mark. Also on Timor is the site of Lai Li, and this also has dates going back to around 45,000 years ago. In addition to these two islands, we have another site or series of sites in southern Sulawesi, and these are famous for their rock art, which you may have heard of. Really, really impressive work there that also go back to around 40,000 years ago. So unfortunately, none of these dates for early Homo sapien occupation in Wallacea predate the earliest dates that we have from Australia. And what this means is that the archaeological record in Australia is the earliest indirect evidence for maritime crossings by our species anywhere in the world. Because in order to get to Australia, they had to cross the various water crossings of Wallacea. So this then begs the question of, well, how did they get here? What route did they take through this island archipelago to reach the shores of Australia and New Guinea? And in 1977, Joseph Birdsall proposed two different routes, a northern route through here, Route 1, and a southern route through these islands here. Since then, there's been a few other possibilities proposed, although what you will see is that the majority of them are sort of terminating in one of two options, either up around the Bird's Head of New Guinea or down here around Arnhem Land in Northern Australia. And the way that Birdsall came up with these different routes is what he termed his shipping routes. And he used 3 key variables: target distance, or distance between islands, target height or island height, and target width or island width. Now, Birdsall did this back in 1977, and essentially my PhD in many ways was a modern take on the research that he did. So while he was stuck with his charts and rulers and various things to measure his islands and the distances, I was able to use GIS, which is known as Geographic Information Systems, a really amazing software resource. I used ArcGIS, but there's also many other programs out there. And this meant that we could use digital elevation models and global geographic databases to measure distance and height and width and calculate these in the computer program. So not only improving accuracy, but it improves the speed and general coverage of the project that we can do. In addition to this, there's been significant advances in sea level models for the past. And so we were able to use one from 2001 from the Huon Peninsula, which is very close to our region of interest. And another thing that I added in my project was an uplift rate. So this island region of Sulawesi is one of the most tectonically active areas in the world. And by combining a uplift variable, we're able to account for that difference, which can be quite substantial when you have rates of around 0.5 metre to 1 metre every 1,000 years. When you're going back 50,000 or 60,000 years, that makes a big difference on the amount of island that is above sea level at the time. So as a result, we were able to combine our digital elevation and sea level models, as well as this uplift variable, and significantly improve the reconstruction of the paleogeography, so what our area looked like back in the past. And this means that then our island distances, our island heights, and our island widths can be calculated not just for the present, but for the past as well, with significantly better accuracy than was available back in 1977. Another measure that we included, which when we think about the variables that Birdsall used, while distance is quite self-explanatory, looking at island height and island width are essentially variables of visibility. They're about when you're setting sail, traveling between islands, the height of the island that you're going to, the width of that island, all significantly impact how visible it will be and how easy it is to reach and navigate towards. And so for my PhD project, I came up with 2 measures of visibility. The first one being what we termed relative intervisibility. So this is visibility at sea relative to the viewer. So where you can go and see land. And what we end up with is these kind of buffers of visibility. So here, this is a paleogeographic reconstruction of our Wallacean region at about 50,000 years ago. And everywhere in this light blue shading are places that are modeled that you can travel in some sort of watercraft, we don't know exactly what type, and not go out of sight of land. So you might go out of sight of your home island, but by the time you're out of sight of your home island, you're within sight of some other island, depending obviously on what direction you go in. The second measure of visibility is what we termed absolute intervisibility. And this is the one where if you stand on the shore of your island, you can see the shore of another island. And this was an estimate only. You'll see it basically halves the region that is covered. And we were only able to estimate this, unfortunately, because the computational measures required to get it accurately went beyond the scope of my project. But also when I consider how these people would have travelled in the past, relative intervisibility, where it's the person in the boat travelling, going out fishing every day, that's the measure that is likely to be much more significant, have a greater impact on how people are exploring their world than just measures from someone standing on the coast. So once we have all these variables and all this data, how do we model dispersal? How do we look at how people are moving through the landscape? So in 2005, this team of Field and La did what's called a least cost pathway analysis of human dispersal from Africa to Australia. And least cost is essentially just the least cost of energy. So the most energy efficient way to move through the landscape. And their model was based on slope and distance from rivers. However, you'll notice that down here, while we have nice dark lines of the model running through Southeast Asia, and we have them in Australia, the dotted lines in our Wallacean area are there because they weren't able to model that region. And they essentially just overlaid Birdsall's original roots in this area. So we're still missing the data for our key area of interest. And the reason for this was when they put the cost in on all their different variables. So here we have our different slopes, and basically it says if something is flat, there's virtually no cost. It's very easy to walk across. If something is really a steep cliff or something, then it's very difficult for a person to essentially climb up that cliff. Quite self-explanatory. Similarly, to walk along riverbanks and follow rivers is quite easy. But then they said to cross really big rivers and to cross the sea, it's impossible. They excluded that from their model. And because the ocean was classified as impermeable, that's why their model was unable to account for the Wallacean crossings. So how do we correct this? How do we broaden the scope of this model? We assign costs to sea travel, and we can use our intervisibility measurements, that both the relative and absolute intervisibility, as well as just general distance from the coast, because presumably the further one travels, the more difficult it gets. You're going to run out of water eventually, all those kinds of things. In addition to this, for my PhD, I also then created 3 variables for difficulty of sea travel. So this can essentially stand for something like how sophisticated your maritime capabilities might be, because we really don't know a lot about what kind of watercraft people would have had. We know they had to have some capabilities, but we, unfortunately, boats or canoes, all those sorts of things, they don't tend to preserve very well in the archaeology record. So we don't have that, unfortunately, but we can have assumptions. And so that's what these variables are. We have a variable for sort of easy sea travel or high maritime favorability. So maybe the conditions are very favorable for travel. We have a medium model and then a hard or low favorability model for maritime travel. And so that's just an additional variable to include in the model. So what I ended up with for my PhD was the slope energy values, the same as that original out of Africa one, as well as distance from rivers. But then we have our distance from land, our intervisibility at sea, and then the maritime travel favorability variables. And these are some of the results. I will quickly point out that 65,000 years ago, I did this modelling from between 70 to 45,000 years ago, but these two show the extremes in sea level for that period of time. So 65,000 years was when sea level was at its lowest in this time period, and 70 was when it was at its highest. Both these levels are still lower than today, but the 71 was a bit higher. And as you can see, overwhelmingly, the northern route into Southall is favoured by the model. The 70,000 one did come up with a secondary, less likely route that takes the southern path. And we think maybe this is because with rising sea levels and increasing water gaps between islands, perhaps the northern route loses some of its overwhelming favourability in having such close water crossings that it does in the lower sea levels. So since I published this in 2018, and just also pointing out that we have, when we run our model from the oldest site in Southall of Lida Aja to our oldest site in Australia of Majabibi, we're also having the model go through the northern route. It prefers going up through here than along this one. And mainly what's pushing it is these large water gaps between Timor and Northern Australia. But yeah, so since I published my research, there's been a number of models using relatively similar data sets and approaches, various combinations thereof, looking at intervisibility and currents and distances between islands. And while they have come up with some slightly different results, overwhelmingly, the general trend is that the northern route is the most favourable of these options. So let's have a look at how this looks compared to our archaeology record. If you remember from the beginning of this, I spoke about some of the sites that are pushing back closer to our 50,000 dates of Australia. But there's been a lot of work recently done on these islands in the sort of southern Wallaceian islands. So on Flores, there's been multiple excavations at multiple sites that haven't really recovered any dates older than about 48,000 for Homo sapiens, for modern humans. In Timor, similarly, multiple excavations, multiple sites, no dates older than about 46,000. Then we have a number of other little islands that have one or two sites, all also coming in much more recently than the sites that we have in Australia. So from this, we can say, well, we may still be missing the sites. They may still just be yet to be found. However, the amount of data here that is all coming in younger than the sites that we're looking for suggests that perhaps this area of Wallacea was maybe only occupied by humans sort of after 48,000 years ago. So let's have a look at our northern area, the islands that we're interested in. And when we look at the archaeology record for this region, while the Sulawesi site does go back about 40,000 years ago, when we have a closer look at the islands in here, there's really only two sites that have been excavated so far, and they're, as you can see, quite recent. And then we also have a site on New Guinea, but again, it's not getting anywhere near the Australian sites. And by comparison, the amount of archaeological research that's been done in this region, and in particular research that's focused on initial occupation. So there has been some limited archaeological research looking at sort of more recent Austronesian arrival periods, but looking at that initial occupation of Homo sapiens, of our species, there's been much, much less work done in this region than has been done in these southern islands. And so for me, this was the really big exciting part of my PhD, of the results of the model, was to highlight this region as the place to go next, and the place to go and do the research and, you know, boots on the ground, that kind of plan. And so now we actually have what's called the Northern Gateway Flagship Project of CARBA, of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. And in particular, the key nodes involved in this are the Australian National University, the University of Wollongong, Arkanas, which is the Indonesian government archaeology department, and the Universitas Gadjah Mada, which is an Indonesian university based in Yogyakarta. And for this project so far, research has been conducted on the island of Obi, on the island of Seram, and on the island of Mizil. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the island of Obi and its neighbour Bisa, where we conducted fieldwork in 2019, and we're hoping to conduct it about now, or about a month ago, but unfortunately that's been delayed a little bit, but we will hope to get out there very soon. So we went to Obi. It was a bit of an adventure and a trek, several planes and ferries and various little boats to get to where we need to go, and hiking through the jungle. But we found a few small sites that we did some test excavations at. And you can see from this map, there's also a number of other sites that we've identified with archaeological potential on these two islands. So hopefully we'll get back there and have a look. So the excavations that we did conduct near this village known as Kello, the records go back about 18,000 years ago. So we still haven't found those sites that predate occupation in Australia. But interestingly, we did find shell and stone axes that the dates for these are the earliest records for this region. And that's pretty exciting, particularly when these types of tools are often associated with the technology required to build more sophisticated watercraft. So there may have been some sort of change or turnover in techniques to move between islands that was going on in this region. And of course, this seems to be a regular thing in archaeology survey, and perhaps just a Murphy's Law situation, but on the very last day of our trip to Obi, we were fortunate to find a very promising looking site. You can see our local helpers here looking very pleased with themselves. And one of the reasons why this is so promising is you can see this big mound of dirt soil build up here. That means we've got at least a good sort of 1.5 meters of deposit that can be excavated. And the surface of the deposit had a lot of really interesting archaeological artifacts that suggests the high potential of the site. And it's also a lot closer to the coast than the sites that we'd excavated previously. So we hope that it will be less impacted by changing sea levels that can potentially encourage people to abandon sites for short periods of time. And so potentially we'll have a more continuous record of occupation for Obi at this site. So that's where we're going next whenever we're allowed to go. But in the meantime, we can geochemically source some of the obsidian that's come from the Kello sites to look into questions of inter-island networks. And I'm also planning to analyse the couscous assemblages so we can test theories of human translocations of these species between different islands. In addition to this, the other Kaaba teams are continuing their work in Seram and Mosul, and the whole Northern Gateway project team will continue to work on the various islands in this region, and hopefully we will not only improve and bring our knowledge of the archaeology of this region up to a similar level as the southern Wallacine Islands, but perhaps we will find that site that's pushing back past 50,000 years ago. So thank you very much, and thank you all for listening.